Silently abandoned, and most of the time without explanation, now lay many Disney attractions, rides, and vehicles that once were a part of Disney history. So join us today to take a look at some more attractions that were abandoned by Disney.
Okay, everybody, now hold on to your hats for the last and most exciting destination. Well, here I am, 130 feet in the air atop the Disney MGM Studio Earful Tower to tell you about an exciting new movie studio being built right here at Walt Disney World.
Created so it could be a theme park and an actual production studio, MGM Studios opened on May 1st, 1989, having as one of its main attractions the Backstage Studio Tour.
The Backstage Tour gives visitors a behind-the-scenes look at the back lot. You can actually watch movies in the making. These soundproof observation corridors give guests an unobstructed bird's-eye view of TV shows, such as the Mickey Mouse Club.
The attraction had, without a doubt, one of the longest durations in any Disney park. The tour lasted more than 2 hours. Guests hopped on board a train that took them to an exclusive behind-the-scenes tour of a set, where you could go to the costuming zone where designers created the clothes worn by stars, then to the scenic shop. Next, you would go into Residential Street, where you could see the Golden Girls house. Then you would enter Catastrophe Canyon.
Catastrophe Canyon is sure to blow you out of the water.
This was an amazing set that would let you be a part of artificial disasters, like an earthquake or a fire. Then the tram took guests to a New York City street, where forced perspective buildings at the end of the street made these 2 blocks look like an entire cityscape. The final part of the tour took guests walking to a water effects tank, a special effects workshop, into some of the sound stages that were built in the park, and the post-production editing and audio. And finally, into the Walt Disney Theater, where guests got to see special sneak previews of new Disney movies.
Excuse me, will you sit down, please? You're blocking our view.
Ooh, sorry, Mr. Eisner. Excuse me. It'll never happen again.
Thanks. Roll it.
As time passed, this attraction lost popularity and the duration time was reduced. And by the time 1989 was ending, the New York section of the tour was open and became accessible for all guests, so they could walk around without having to get into the tram. In 1991, the attraction's name was changed to Backstage Studio Tour, featuring Catastrophe Canyon, and the attraction was divided into 2 attractions. The Backstage Studio Tour was the part that used the tram, and the walking part of the tour became Inside the Magic, Special Effects, and Production Tour. Now, this park was intended to be an actual production studio, as we said at the beginning, but ironically, thanks to this attraction, that concept failed. Why? Well, Catastrophe Canyon was pretty loud, and that made it hard for anything to be actually filmed. So as time went by, some of the sound stages were left empty. The Walt Disney Theater, where previews of Disney movies were shown, was transformed into a stage show called Here Come the Muppets, and then after a while, it was changed again to the long-running live show, The Voyage of the Little Mermaid. It wasn't until 1994 when it was determined that the original plans for MGM Studios had failed. During this time, the tram tour was reduced to 25 minutes and the visual effects tour to 35 minutes. Then, in 1996, the tour was renamed the Studio Backlot Tour, and its entrance moved to the far end of Mickey Avenue, where the walking tour had previously begun. Inside the Magic was also renamed and became known as Backstage Pass, using a subtitle of any movie or TV show that was in production during that time, in the remaining sound stages. Things remained that way until 2001, when Backstage Pass was closed forever, and its entrance was repurposed as the Tram Tour entrance. That same year, Soundstage 3 was opened to the public to house Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Play It. There were many other changes done to this area as time passed. Residential Street was removed in 2003 so it could make way for the huge lights, motors, action, extreme stunt show. The remaining sound stages were permanently closed in 2008 to make way for Toy Story Mania. And there were refurbishments in 2009 and 2010 where many things were fixed. On September 20th, 2014, it was announced that the attraction would be temporarily closed. But then on September 28th, the marquee and sign that were at the entrance were completely removed and painted over. At the time, there was no word on what would replace this, or if it would ever come back. So it remained abandoned for a while. Then, in 2015, it was announced that the lands that would replace this part of the park, as well as most of the streets of America, would be Toy Story Land and Galaxy's Edge. Construction began in 2016, demolishing most of the tour's area. Catastrophe Canyon was destroyed and the trams are still abandoned somewhere in Disney's junkyards. Walt Disney Junkyard, Lake Bay area. We've all wondered, where do all the props and vehicles from closed rides or attractions end up? And most of the time, we hope they end up safe and sound in the Walt Disney Archives. But sadly, this is not the case of many of these things. Just behind the Magic Kingdom, we can find the Disney Junkyard. This area of land was once planned to be used for a resort called Disney's Persian Resort. This resort would have been themed around Iran. Early drawings and descriptions showed that the buildings would have been made to look like ancient mosques with tall white columns and large blue domes. The resort would have also been connected to the monorail system, and it would have had a marina. Like the Asian resort, it would also have had a 4-story main building that included restaurants and shops, while the guest rooms would be in separate buildings circling the main building. Not much else is known about the Persian resort. It is believed that construction never started after the 1973 oil embargo hurt the tourism industry. Rumor is that the Shah of Iran offered to fund some of the project's construction and operation, but the 1979 Iranian Revolution caused the project to be shelved, and this area remained empty. Nowadays, this area is the Disney Junkyard. Here we can see that several vehicles and props of closed-up rides were abandoned and left to rot. Here's where we could once find the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea submarines. Today, we can still find lots of pieces of Disney history just rotting away in the junkyard. There are some Pirates of the Caribbean boats, a monorail car, the original Davy Crockett canoes, tons of trash cans from different lands and parks, tiki statues, ticket booths, and even Madame Leota's cart. We can also see that there are many closed containers, and we can only imagine the hidden gems they probably hold. Mark Twain Riverboat, Disneyland, Paris. Thunder Mesa Riverboat Landing opened along with Euro Disney back in 1992. In this area, we could find 2 riverboats, the Mark Twain, which was based on the original Disneyland Mark Twain riverboat, and the Molly Brown, the only side wheeler in any Disney park, named after a Titanic survivor. Each of these boats took guests through a journey around Big Thunder Mountain and Wilderness Island, while we could listen to a recorded conversation between the captain and Mark Twain or Molly Brown, depending on which riverboat we were on. Since the storyline takes place in the fictional town of Thunder Mesa, most of the spiel details with the sights of Big Thunder Mountain, Phantom Manor, Wilderness Island, Smuggler's Cove, an old snoring fisherman, Yellowstone National Park geysers, dinosaur remains, and more. These boats could carry up to 400 passengers per trip, and normally just one riverboat was running at the time, although during the busiest summer months they could both be in operation. During the Halloween seasons of 2003 and 2004, the Mark Twain riverboat was turned into the Phantom Cruise Line, and a huge ghostly statue appeared in front of the boat. These 2 boats kept working perfectly for a while until 2006, when the Molly Brown's engine overheated. The smoke damaged the ship and the engines, and it remained out of operation for many months. The Molly Brown kept going in and out of refurbishment, while the Mark Twain kept working. Then, in 2010, the Molly Brown had to be rebuilt from scratch, so the Mark Twain was the only boat that was operating. But then, in 2011, the Mark Twain was used to break the ice in the river, and it got stuck. Trying to free the boat, it was pulled, and this caused some damage to the bottom of the boat, and the whole deck was bent. This caused the Mark Twain to go into refurbishment right after the Molly Brown was done. Sadly, this refurbishment didn't come soon enough. The boat was stationed in the dry dock and was left there to rot. Some time passed, and Disney decided to build a kind of barn around the Mark Twain, so guests couldn't see the bad conditions that the boat was in. The Mark Twain had remained in dry dock, except when the Molly Brown had to go into refurbishment. During these periods of time, the boat is taken out and sometimes covered with a sheet so that no one can see the state that it's in. It's pretty sad to see how abandoned the boat has become. Thankfully, plans have been announced to fully restore the boat and bring it back to its former glory. Sum of Thrills, Innoventions East. In our last video, we talked about Innoventions, a museum created by Disney so the most important brands would bring exhibitions where they would show their newest products and, with this, show the guests how technology kept and would keep changing in the years to come. Since it opened in 1994, Innoventions always tried to stay on top of the latest in technology, having new sponsors and exhibitions.
What's exciting about Innoventions is that it isn't one thing. It's a constantly changing trade show. It's what people never get to see.
It had its first renovation in 1998 when it changed completely to adapt to the newest technology. The name and theme changed, and it became Road to Tomorrow, where guests were able to follow a path that took them to every exhibition in a more structured way. But of course, technology caught up again, and in 2007, Innoventions went through another renovation, losing the Road to Tomorrow title. With this new renovation came a new aesthetic and new exhibitions, and on October 14th, 2009, Innoventions opened a very innovative attraction called Sum of Thrills. Sponsored by Raytheon, the ride let park guests custom design their own thrill ride, using mathematical tools, a touchscreen table, and a robotic simulator. Yep, you could design a thrill ride, where you could determine height and speed while adding features such as dips and corkscrew turns. Once you finish building the ride, you could climb aboard your customized design in the 4D robotic simulator that used sight, sound, and movement to give them a realistic experience. The attraction also had 3 different vehicle options. You could choose bobsled, roller coaster, and jet aircraft. It was possible to program actual loops into both the coaster and jet courses, with the robotic arm swinging the rider upside down. You could also choose the kind of turns, loops, and hills in the track design. There were choices from mild broad curves to extreme multi-loop inversions. In spite of the low capacity this attraction had, it was extremely popular. As time passed, many exhibitions closed because sponsor contracts ended. And finally, on April 30th, 2015, because of a lack of interest and exhibitions, Innoventions West was done. Some of the space was utilized for meet and greet areas for Baymax and Joy and Sadness, making Innoventions East the only active part of this area. And while Innoventions wasn't even the shadow of what it once was, it still had an interesting attraction. Until May 2016, when Sum of Thrills disappeared completely from the park's map. And the page that let guests revisit their rides put up a notice saying that ride replays would only be available for guest review until June 30th, 2016. Without explanation, Sum of Thrills closed. The closing of this attraction was probably due to the contract with Raytheon ending. Innoventions took another blow on March of this year, when Disney announced that Innoventions West would be demolished as part of Epcot's renovation. Innoventions East is now practically abandoned, as it only has 2 exhibitions, and the Sum of All Thrills is still there. Abandoned as well. It is boarded up behind a wall. We can see that the robotic arm, the controls, and the signs remain there, covered in dust. It is truly sad to think that, ironically, the future and newest technology was what put an end on Innoventions as we know it. Fort Wilderness Railroad, Walt Disney World. Fort Wilderness Resort and Campground is one of the 3 original resorts that opened along with the Magic Kingdom. This resort had a train system that took guests through the woods around the Magic Kingdom to different locations. This system was the Fort Wilderness Railroad. The Fort Wilderness Railroad was planned to be open along with the resort, but Disney decided not to build it in order to save money. After a while, in 1972, the construction of this railroad system started. The railroad had a fleet of 4 steam engine locomotives that had space for 20 guests each. The Fort Wilderness Railroad opened in 1974, and for 5 years it was one of the most loved transportation systems for guests. The railroad's route was one of the longest ever created in a Disney park, and it took guests through amazing landscapes with trees, fields, and even to the river country swimming hole, of which we talked about in part 1, if you want to check that out here. The train's tickets cost $1, and you could ride it as many times a day as you wanted, from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. As time passed, the railroad started having many problems due to its popularity and overuse. Also, the ground conditions in which the rails were built were not optimal because they were built over a swamp, so this resulted in lots of damage to the rails. This caused small train derails, and of course repairing this was pretty expensive. Another problem that the railroad had was that the tanks didn't hold enough water for the train to do the complete tour, and there was only one water tower where the train could be refilled. So if cast members running the train forgot to refill the tank, the train would run out of water mid-trip. Because of this, Disney designed a tow motor car to tow the train back to the depot to be refueled, but guests had to wait through all this process, and they lost a lot of time. The Fort Wilderness Resort continued to gain popularity, so Disney expanded the campground many times so it could accommodate more guests. And this was a big problem for the railroad. Why? Well, the route chosen for the railroad often brought it within feet of campsites, with no barrier of any kind, and kids often walked on or placed pennies down the track. Of course, this was dangerous because the trains could not stop quickly, and in 1979, the inevitable happened. A girl was riding her bike in the tracks, and one of the trains hit her. Thankfully, she was not seriously injured, but Disney decided that they wouldn't wait until a worse accident happened. And within 2 weeks of this event, the Fort Wilderness Railroad stopped operating for good. Disney had the trains removed and introduced trams to transport visitors from the parking lot to the park's entrance. The trains and wagons were stored in a warehouse, and the tracks were completely abandoned. After a while in the mid-1980s, the trains were taken out of storage, only to be covered with tarps, exposed to the elements, and left to rot. They stayed there until 2 of the passenger cars were taken so that they could be used as ticket booths in Pleasure Island. But when Pleasure Island closed, these cabins were forgotten again. Some of the other engines and wagons were restored by collectors. Another was used as a prop at Typhoon Lagoon for a while, but then was retired and destroyed. And many others are still rotting away. The railroad's tracks are barely visible, but they remain abandoned. This is pretty sad, especially because this was one of the most popular methods of transportation among guests. Global Neighborhood, Epcot. Global Neighborhood opened in 1994, replacing the Earth Station as Spaceship Earth's pre-show. Its mission was to demonstrate how easy to use, complex, and powerful technology was. This exhibition had 5 main areas: Interactive Wonderland. Here, the Cheshire Cat took guests to the future of television where, using voice commands, you could watch movies, enjoy interactive games, and even do some shopping. All of this using your own TV. You don't say. Here, guests learned that word-for-word translations don't always lead to a clear understanding of what's being said. So, you can learn to interpret idiomatic expressions in different languages. Communication breakthrough. Here, you could break down the walls of communication with a virtual paddle and, via video link, see the person you're speaking and playing with. Storyteller phone. This exhibition let the caller choose a fantasy background so that it sounded like they were calling from another place. AT&T Network. This was a simulator ride where guests would cruise on AT&T's fiber optic information superhighway and experience a constant flow of information, from encyclopedias to thousands of phone conversations to movies on demand. The original Global Neighborhood was renovated during the late summer and early fall of 1999, reopening as AT&T's new Global Neighborhood on November 24, 1999. The simulation ride in the center of the room was replaced with a giant tree made out of cables that changed color. The tree's roots weaved down under a glass floor that featured the outlines of the world's continents. Several holes in the tree were provided for guests to peer into and have their pictures taken. These pictures were then shown up on video screens hanging from the branches of the tree. In addition, there were several plastic booths, which allowed guests to navigate through Epcot's new attractions. In 2003, AT&T's contract with Disney ended, so the sponsorship for this whole area was terminated in 2004. And instead of turning this area into something else at the moment, the neighborhood was boarded up, covered, and abandoned. The fiber optic trees stopped lighting up, the touchscreen monitors were covered with dirt and dust, and most of the wire bridges were removed. This area remained abandoned for 3 whole years until, in 2007, Spaceship Earth received another overhaul. Which of these would you want to come back? Let us know in the comments. Also, we're teaming up again with Ye Olde Prop Shop for another amazing giveaway. All you need to do is follow us on Instagram, like our latest post, and tell us what your favorite Epcot pavilion is and why. Please go check out Ye Olde Prop Shop, where you can find lots of amazing signs like these. Thank you so much, and see you next time.